Good morning and welcome to the EarthX Conservation Conference panel on forestry. My name is Mark Rey. I'm on the faculty of the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources at Michigan State University. Our purpose today is to discuss land management in wildfire-prone forests, particularly in the context of the worsening fires that we've seen over the last several fire seasons. Our panel with us today is Chuck Leavell, a musician, author, and owner of Charlane Woods in Georgia. Dan Tomascheki, who's the Vice President for Resources at Sierra Pacific Industries, a large forest products corporation with a substantial acreage of land in both California and Washington. And third, we have Bob Williams, the president and founder of Pine Creek Forestry in New Jersey. After our panel today, you'll also hear from Jim Peterson, the founder and president of the Evergreen Foundation in Oregon, and Michael Raines, a retired research scientist and U.S. Forest Service deputy chief, who's from Pennsylvania. So I think we have a good geographical representation here today. I'm now going to let the panelists that are here with me self-introduce so that I don't have to read their bios and mess them up. We'll start with you, Chuck, and then Dan, and then Bob.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark, so much, and great to be here on this panel. And I am Chuck Leavell, currently unemployed musician, mainly due to the COVID virus. But I'm also the owner of Charlane Woods, as you mentioned. We have about 4,000 acres here in central Georgia. I've been working on this place since 1981. As Mark mentioned, I have written a few books, 3 of them on the subject of forestry and the environment. And I do actively manage and work our place. As a matter of fact, since COVID has come around and I'm not able to tour as I normally would be as a musician, that's exactly what I've been doing, is working almost every day in our woods to do anything I can to improve things. And it's been kind of a joy to do that, actually, because I've always wished I could take enough time off to concentrate and focus on the work here. So even though COVID is keeping me from touring, it's been a blessing in that way. It's good to be with everyone.
You're probably the only person who didn't gain weight during the COVID pandemic. Dan, you're next.
Hi, I'm Dan Tomascheki. I'm Vice President of Sierra Pacific Industries, a family-held company based in Northern California. We have about 2.1 million acres of forest land, 1.6 or so in California, another 400 plus in Washington. We're a large producer of softwood lumber for housing and lots of other purposes. We have 15 sawmills. We have 7 wood-fired cogeneration plants where we burn wood waste, electricity that we use, and we also sell into the grid. We have an extensive reforestation program. Anywhere from 7 to 12 million trees a year are planted. And of course, we have a long and sometimes turbulent experience with fires, particularly in Northern California. I've worked for the company for 42 years, and I run all of the forestry operations and have a lot to do with resource policy and the politics and all that, everything that goes with that.
Bob.
Hello, I'm really happy to be here with you guys. And I'm a forester here in southern New Jersey in the world famous Pine Barrens. And of course, you all know that the Pine Barrens are a fire-prone ecosystem. We assist both public and private landowners in the management of their forest, and we actually spend as much time trying to get people to start fires as we do put them out. So I'm just happy to be here today and look forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. So let me pose the first question to all of you. And that question is pretty straightforward. What is causing the rise in and the increased intensity of wildfires today? We hear a lot of different causes, from climate change to improper management of forest fuels, to too much construction of homes and infrastructure in fire-prone areas to some people who want to say that it's all of the above. So Dan, why don't you take the first crack at that question? Why is this happening?
Well, it's first of all, there is, and you see it in the media all the time, this debate, it's bad forest management. No, it's not, it's climate change. Well, dividing the world that simplistically and pointing fingers, I don't think is very productive and doesn't capture what's been happening out there. And there are a number of things that are occurring. One is, at least in California, in the West, an increased amount of forest fuels. Trees grow, Mother Nature grows trees. Trees are a miracle. They turn sunlight with some frozen water into some large, beautiful thing that everybody treasures. So trees grow and vegetation grows. And so the fuels out of the forest, particularly in California for 100 years here, as we thought that all fire suppression, putting fires out was a good thing. That's one. We have had, one thing that people forget in this debate is, just as in this year, when we burned 4 million acres in California, every 5, 7, 8 years, you get the perfect storm. You get a dry winter, which is really important. And we had a very dry winter. If you notice, in 2019, where we had one of the wettest winters on record, we hardly had any fires because fuels dried out late in the summer. We just didn't have that amount of dry fuel ready to burn. We also then, every 5, 7, 8 years, we get a period of dry lightning, and we had thousands of dry lightning strikes in the state. And then you couple that with all the people that are living close to the forest, and I get that. I live close to trees around my house. Trees are valued for shade, for privacy, for beauty, all of the things. But we have, particularly in California, more and more people living out in the forest, and it's hard for them to visualize what can happen with a big fire. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done around houses, and we have more and more of them. And what happens, and this is natural, the firefighting agencies want to protect the homes and structures that are out there. People that own them certainly want them protected. So, and you can see, as an example, in these last fires, there's for instance, CAL FIRE engine crew parked at every house out in the forest in anticipation of the fire coming. But what that does, and I'm not criticizing that approach at all, but it does suck resources from the agency who are parked at all those rural houses, while those resources could be used to stop the advance of the large fire that's coming. So it's a perfect storm of a number of events. It's not simple. You can't explain it in one soundbite. And for people to try to simplify it and use it for political purposes, I think does all of us.
Chuck, would you like to add to that?
Sure. Well, I think Dan gave a great answer to the question. I forgot in the intro to mention that I have a fledgling television program called America's Forest, and we were able to do one segment in California that focused to a degree on the fires in that area. We went to Paradise, California, and saw the incredible devastation there caused by the Camp Fire I guess 2 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe now. We also did a segment on what is being done, some of the things being done to help prevent these catastrophic fires. One was to try to get neighborhoods and communities more comfortable with the idea of prescribed burns. A lot of people fear fire, and I think if they can better understand the use of prescribed burns and how they work and the benefits that can be had by doing them very carefully, I think they get more and more comfortable with the concept. And I think it could also have a great benefit to preventing these catastrophic fires. Another thing that we saw in California that Governor Newsom had approved and that CAL FIRE was involved in, as well as I think some other agencies, and that was to use some mulching techniques throughout either side of some of the major highways to get rid of some of the heavy litter and to maintain them so that they are clearer and don't have the heavy underbrush that can start a fire. So that I think it was about 150 feet on either side of the highway that they were doing this practice. And I think that can also greatly reduce the incidence of wildfire. Let me just mention that, here in Georgia, we practice prescribed burns on a much regular basis than I think is done throughout other states. And of course, throughout the Southeast, that's true as well. But I can tell you that I've been doing this for many, many years. And if it's done correctly and carefully, it can be one of the best tools that a forest landowner can have. And not only do the prescribed burns help reduce the incidence of wildfires, but they also can be a great benefit to wildlife habitat. So we do it a little bit different here. I understand that states like California and states out west have stricter regulations, and it's not as easy to get permitting to do these prescribed burns. But I think perhaps that's going to be changing as we go forward. I hope it will change because I think it can be a benefit. I also agree that climate change is definitely in the mix. There's no doubt about it. Here in Georgia, not this year, but I think 2018 and 19, we set records for the most days of triple digits, the most days in the 90-degree plus degree, temperature. And I think you're seeing this in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. And this can have a negative effect when it comes to wildfires. There's no doubt about it. And we also went through a drought in 2019. So as Dan mentioned, when you combine that drought with dry weather and conditions that are susceptible for these fires, that can be a very dangerous combination. And finally, on the subject of housing, I know that people like to live near beautiful areas, and whether it's beaches, and we see, of course, more and more hurricanes and heavy weather patterns on the coastal communities in our country, but that's also true of the wildfires and the places that are susceptible to that building community. So, I think we just need to be cognizant of that. And perhaps one of the things we can do if people are going to live in these areas is try to create a circumference around the areas to help prevent fires getting into them. So there's no easy answers for sure, but maybe some of these things can be of benefit.
Bob, jump in and tell us what you think the main causes are, or what's your perspective?
Certainly agree with everything that's been said and probably couldn't say it better. Here, of course, in southern New Jersey, we're probably on the urban interface that's on steroids. I mean, you talk about a population of people living right in and next to this really significantly large forest. I'd take a little bit deeper. I've become convinced that it's more of a social political problem. I think we know technically many of the things we could be doing, should be doing, that we haven't been doing. But I think the bigger issue is really we need to get our people more in tune with the land. They don't understand these forests. They don't understand people that cut trees. And I think we need to really find solutions of how we're going to educate our people to get a relationship with forest and the land and understand that they're really part of it. They're not aliens. They're not intruders. They're not, conquerors. They are part of this world. And until our populations, our citizens, get a better relationship with the land, I think these problems are going to continue and maybe get worse.
Let's talk a little bit more about prescribed burning. I think, Chuck, you gave us a pretty fair appreciation for its benefits. There are places, however, where air quality regulations make it almost impossible to get enough prescribed burning done to really make an appreciable difference. What should the balance there? How should the balance be struck in those cases? Chuck, you can start, and then Dan, since you are managing a lot of land in California, you can tell us the difficulties in getting burn permits in California. Chuck.
Okay, well, you are right, Mark. It's difficult when you're trying to do prescribed burns around communities that have a significant population. You are going to create some smoke, and that can create some bad air quality. There's no doubt about it. I think understanding the conditions is a huge part of it. I can't emphasize enough how careful you have to be to do this and to do it correctly. You have to understand how much moisture is in the ground from recent rains or whether it's very, very dry, what the humidity factor is, what the barometric pressure factors is, what is the wind conditions, from what direction are they coming. And, you know, here in Georgia, when we do this, we just look for those ideal days. I'm not sure you can say they're ideal, but for the best possible weather conditions to do this practice. And of course, you want to put out signs near any highways, prescribed burn in progress, please drive slow, use your headlights, that kind of thing. There are courses given with the Georgia Forestry Commission here in our state to teach landowners and others that are foresters or whatever about these techniques and how to use them. There's equipment that you can have on your person that can measure wind speed, measure a barometric pressure and humidity and that kind of thing. And I think it's really important to employ all of these safety factors when you're going to do this. I'm not sure there's an easy answer around the community situation other than to just try to get the people that are living in these communities to better understand the practice. And okay, maybe you're going to do this on a certain day and maybe you want to go into town and do your shopping that day and not be around to breathe in the smoke. I'm not sure there's a perfect way to deal with all of that. But again, I just have to say that especially here in the Southeast, this practice is a great, great benefit and can really, really help reduce the incidence of those terrible wildfires that we see oftentimes out west.
And tell us what it's like to try to prescribe burn in California.
Okay, well, there are some real challenges. One, a lot of the terrain is deeper than the Southeast or other places, so that always presents a challenge. Second, the fuel loading, what we call fuel loading on the ground, in a lot of places in California is so high that introducing dry fire into it is really difficult because there is so much that's going to burn. It's hard to keep it from getting away. There are very few burn days every year that we can get a permit for. So you really have to be ready to go when you do get a burn day. Often they get called off at the last minute. There is, as Chuck pointed out, a real task in gaining public acceptance. When you've had something like the campfire that Chuck saw, and I was there the first morning, and you see what's the devastation. Trying to do prescribed fire around town the next year to preclude that from happening again, that scares people, and they're rational. The other thing that's really a structural problem in California is liability laws, unlike Texas, other places. If you have done everything, got a permit, are trained and certified to burn, and start burning on private property, and it gets away in California, you're liable for the suppression costs, which could be millions of dollars. And there needs to be, as in other states, some way of insulating people if they've done everything right, backstopping them so that potential liability is not such a discouraging factor as it is. The other thing that needs to be done here for Forest Service or for private land burning with CAL FIRE is the environmental process. For the Forest Service, California Environmental Quality Act for CAL FIRE. These environmental documents can take a lot of time and be cumbersome and take time to get done, and then of course they can be challenged. So that is a paperwork burden that, particularly on CAL FIRE's end, because they're busy all summer, they don't really have the time to help prepare the paperwork. We can do it on our harvest plans because we have what's called the functional equivalent in our harvest plan process, so they can use that. But the other thing that I think is important to understand is CAL FIRE, for instance, and the foresters, they've been out there all summer, months and months, 24-hour shifts with CAL FIRE, 30, 40 days in a row, because of the nature of the emergency. They're tired. So when you come now to the fall and winter, they've laid most of those firefighters off, and only the people that are full-time remain. And there isn't enough people to then go do the prescribed burning. Those people that could participate in that, and the hand crews and all that, they're gone. They're laid off for the winter. And so the environmental process paperwork is pretty cumbersome. Two, all of those people that could participate in that work and that know what they're doing, they're laid off for the winter, and CAL FIRE and the wants to take money. What we should do is develop a separate fire or prescribed burn force within, for instance, CAL FIRE, whose job is to gain expertise and to work with private landowners to conduct these burns in the fall, winter, and early spring when the weather and the conditions are appropriate. If we don't separate and separately fund an organization under a CAL FIRE to do that work in a large landscape, California has 100 million acres, 40 million acres of forest. So it's a huge, huge prospect. But without some sort of directed effort with people whose job is to do that kind of work, I think we're going to struggle.
Bob, tell us a little bit about the challenges to prescribe burning on a broad scale in New Jersey.
Well, interesting enough, I may have a bit of a positive story in that, for instance, 2 years ago, our legislature passed a new prescribed burn bill that was supported by everyone. Our permitting process is relatively simple. And the reason for that is Southern New Jersey has a historical fire culture. Our cranberry farmers, our blueberry farmers, those families have been burning the forest for over 100 years. So society, the communities around there they're kind of adapted to that. They see smoke in the spring and they don't get excited. We're trying to expand that to the more urban areas because then we get into big problems. They don't want to smell smoke. They don't want smoke in their homes. But in general, the forestry community and the government itself really supports prescribed burning, and we do a lot of it. I agree, it's extremely dangerous, and not just anyone can or should do it, but it's essential to solving the problem. Having a lot of experience with this prescribed burning, I will say, and I try to make people understand, we're not going to burn our way out of this problem. You're never going to get sufficient burn days. Economically, you can't afford to do it, to hire the kind of force that would be required to do it. Forestry techniques will create conditions where we can safely return fire. And it will also allow us to allow some fires to go a little crazy, because we know when that fire gets to a certain place, it's not going to move forward. So it's an essential tool, but it's by no means the magic bullet. And again, New Jersey unique in that, in some ways, I feel like we're the tip of the spear. I mean, we're burning in, right near Philadelphia, not that far from New York City. And people don't get excited and they don't get bent out of shape because they're used to that. And I would comment that it really gets back to when the people arrived off the coast of New Jersey, all the journals mentioned the smoke and smell of fire was because the Native Americans maintained this forest with fire. And they understood it. They maintained the forest in a condition that it didn't blow up like we're seeing now. So, we get back to the human factor. What's natural? To me, I look out the window and that's natural. I see what's going on. And as a human being, I think we have an obligation to try and help the forest, the land. And prescribed burning, it's just really important. You know, what it does, New Jersey was so forward thinking. Our old prescribed burn law only allowed you to burn if you could demonstrate there was a hazard. That really restricted us in somewhat. The new law says you can do that, but if you can also demonstrate that it's essential to the ecology of the land, the forest, our pine snakes, our rare plants, you can get a permit for that reason. I think that is a real step forward, that we're starting to look at the forest as an ecosystem, not as a, you know, a pile of fuel that's going to kill us. So I think we're doing pretty good here in New Jersey.
So, Bob, I think I was intrigued by your statement about what the first Europeans saw when they arrived here. And since I was once a bureaucrat, but now I'm an academic, I think it's time for a pop quiz. So who can tell me what the most densely populated, that is human population, region of the world was in 1491?
I give up.
Central America.
Central Mexico was in
Yeah.
fact the most densely populated part of the world in 1491. More populated per acre than China, than India, than Europe, Western Europe. And what happened in the first couple of decades after first contact is that the spread of European diseases to which Native American populations had no natural resistance, measles and smallpox, decimated, anthropologists think now, upwards of 85% of the population that was indigenous to North America in 1491. So the subsequent explorers saw a largely depopulated landscape, probably by then with more forest fuels in many places than would have otherwise been the case. And I think the point of that is that what people consider now as pristine and natural isn't at all natural, because it's deprived of the impact of fire that indigenous populations used to terraform landscapes for eons before the first European settlers arrived. And that, I think, points to the magnitude of the problem that we're confronting, which gets me to the next question. Since we've talked about the problem now, we've talked about prescribed fire and its limitations. What do you all think are the necessary elements of a solution that can be implemented over a period of enough years to make a difference? Is it to adopt climate mitigation measures, to make larger investments in fuels treatment? Is it to reform regulations that have unintended consequences? Is it better building codes and zoning ordinances? Or is it more effective fire suppression? Bob, I'm going to let you start this time and tell us what you think the essential components of a long-term solution to this need to be. And I'll sit here with the adding machine to tell you how much it's going to cost.
It certainly, we're going to have to change the way we behave. There's no question about that. It's an easy answer to say all of those things have to be integrated into new thinking. Ultimately, we somehow have got to understand that we need to come together and get policies, regulation that promotes the solution. I've been a forester for 40 years. I started my career jumping out of helicopters, putting fires out. 40 years later, I run around trying to convince landowners to let me set their woods on fire. So things have evolved. Our understanding of the fire has changed. We've changed the landscapes. We've changed where we live, what we live in. And it's just going to take us somehow getting together with events like this that not foresters, but regular people could watch us and start thinking about these things so that ultimately it's going to take generations. This is not going to be solved probably in our lifetime, but we could at least get things started in the right direction. I'll go back to what I said before. It's a social political problem. I think the system is broken. There are lots of good people in the Forest Service that know what to do, but they're crippled. Their hands are in handcuffs and their legs are shackled. They can't make a move. So it's a massive problem. And when you put the issue of climate change, people will say, well, we want the forest to be like it was when the Europeans came. Well, how could that be? If the climate isn't to change, that doesn't make any sense. To me, what makes sense is looking at our lands and using 80 years of research and science that we have and start applying that to the land, at the same time dealing with this issue of how are we going to live on this planet if changing the ways that we're doing it today, because it's obviously not working. It's just not. But it need not be the end of the world. I think it should be an opportunity to really change and make things better. We've always done that. Americans are great in preserving the land. I think we're some of the best in the world of keeping land natural or covered with a natural landscape, but we're probably some of the worst stewards. I know foresters don't like it when I say that, but if we were good stewards for 100 years, why were we in this situation? Obviously, we're doing something wrong. And also accept the fact that some of these fires are absolutely natural. These lands burn hard over the millennia. That complicates things because it creates an argument, well, it's not natural. We stopped the fires, now the fires burn hotter. It's a combination of all those things, and it's going to take people getting together and rationally talking to one another and stop yelling and pointing fingers and blaming this group, this person. I know that's a wide-ranging answer, but this is a complex thing, and we have to start somewhere.
Dan, your turn to tell us how it needs to change in California.
Well, there are several things, and one we've already embarked on. After the Camp Fire and the Carr, HERS, Delta fires here 2 years ago, we just said to ourselves, what we're doing here, like Bob says, it's not working. And if you look at who owns the forested landscape, Forest Service owns 20 million acres. People like us, or other private, smaller landowners own about 8. So without all of them working together, we weren't going to get anything done on a landscape level. Of course, fire doesn't respect property lines or anything like that. So we put together with the Forest Service and with CAL FIRE, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, a fire and fuels reduction memorandum of understanding, where we would work together to plan projects across ownership. Where are the priorities? Where are the priorities for wildlife protection, spotted owl protection? Doesn't do any good to have a reserve spotted owl nest if it all burns up. So where should we start work? How can we share data? How can we actually get it done? Chuck mentioned roads. 80% of human-caused fires start along the road. So that's a logical place to start. County roads, state highways, and all kinds of other roads out in the woods. Let's start there. That's one thing that we're doing now, is planning and then supporting each other, implementing projects. So we tie fuel breaks together, say across ownership, that kind of thing. That's now had Caltrans join, the state parks is joining, National Fish and Wildlife Service is joining, State California Fish and Wildlife has joined, and a number of other state parks. So we have now a bigger and bigger roster all the time to try to get work funded and done. Second, here in California, there's so much fuel that, and like I said, fuel loads are so high. We need to find a way to use that material. And one way to use it that's proven technology is with biomass power plants, cogeneration plants. And yes, the power costs more than natural gas for power generation, but it's not a fossil fuel. And the technology exists. We own 7 of those plants. We need some more of those scattered around the state to where everybody can take their orchard prunings or the prunings of the trees around their house, or even people like us at an industrial scale can bring that stuff in and let's turn it into power, and let's start to reduce the fuels that way. The other, as I mentioned earlier, is some independent group under like a CAL FIRE that can do prescribed fires and has the expertise, but also some protection, liability, sort of negligence, that we can get this done. So those are some things that I think should happen here to try to get more prescribed fire. And then when it comes to houses and all of that, there needs to be some responsibility of the homeowner out there to do work around the house, and to if people don't do that kind of work, I'm not sure that the public subsidized insurance rates for people like that. Really speaking frankly, there has to be some recognition of the potential risk and some willingness on the part of the homeowner to try to mitigate that risk for all of us.
Chuck, what have we missed so far in the grand solution?
Well, I certainly want to emphasize a couple of things that Dan said. He said something earlier about manpower, the need for more manpower. And, that means money. You want to make sure these people get paid that are doing these very dangerous jobs, but we need more personnel. I think if we have more personnel when a fire does break out, that maybe that can, mitigate that, but also prevention. Teams that can do some things. I'm glad he mentioned biomass. I had the pleasure of touring their biomass plant and really enjoyed what I saw there. And yes, he's correct. It's going to cost more money to create energy from biomass, but that's a great use for that material. It's a great use for it. If you can get that duff off the forest floor, or as they say, some prunings that can go into chips and make electricity, that's a good thing. And let's not forget that trees are a renewable resource. So I think those were great comments. Also, and I think California and other Western states are doing this more and more, and that is to maintain wider permanent fire breaks. Dan mentioned the connection of, realizing where there might be some gaps that create possible areas that fires can cross. So I think if we look at a network of permanent wide fire breaks, that can help mitigate things out there. And I do also agree on the homeowner responsibility. If you're going to want to live in those prone areas, I think you need to do things around your own property, put some fire breaks around your own property, and take some responsibility and have some preventative measures at hand should things get worse and you are faced with a bad challenge. So those would be my comments.
Okay, I think the discussion of homeowners taking a larger responsibility is a good one. What's happening now really is insurance companies are getting more involved, and building codes are changing, as are design codes for new subdivisions. And what you see if you go into fire-prone areas and look at new construction is subdivisions that are laid out a lot more thoughtfully, both for access for suppression equipment as well as natural fire breaks that are built into the subdivision design. That all having been said, we have a whole inventory of legacy homes. People who loved the big tree in the backyard but wanted to build a deck and built the deck around the big old pine tree so that there's an inch of pine needles on the deck every fall. Let's end by each of you telling us the average landowner or homeowner what they should be focusing on to reduce their individual risks. Bob, I'll start with you and then come back around to Chuck and then Dan.
Well, people who want to live out in the forest have a responsibility. There's a great program called Firewise, where our state agencies go out and help people understand, they need to clear back 100 feet from their homes. Again, it's an educational thing, but I think if you're going to live out in the forest, there's definitely a responsibility. Unfortunately, it's this aversion to cutting a tree or cutting natural things. That's why they're out in the forest. They perceive that as bad, So maintaining a safe zone is critical to survive a fire. You can have fires that the houses do quite fine with if that zone of protection is there. Talk to your forestry agencies. If they have prescribed burn programs, try to get them to burn the woods near you. More and more land is being preserved, and the bulk of that land is not being provided active management or stewardship. We're creating that problem by a lot of that. So get involved. You have to be involved. But I think the biggest thing is that protection of that zone. 100 feet, I think 100 feet's a little light. I would go further, 150 feet. You have to cut all the trees, but you can certainly minimize and give the firefighters a zone where they could backfire from or fight the fire. If the brush is right up to your house, you have no chance. You really don't. So I would, and I give people that advice all the time.
Chuck.
I would certainly echo everything that Bob just said. Awareness is a big factor. If people are aware of what can happen and take measures to prevent the worst case scenarios, I totally agree on 150 foot border around your property, around your house. Other firefighting tools can be employed. Make sure there are some specialty rakes, some specialty brooms. So, of course, have water sources as often as you can around the property. Blowers, when you're dealing with leaves on your property, if you make sure those leaves are blown away from the home in a fashion so that they wouldn't encourage fire to come up into your backyard. And again, fire extinguishers, if you have fire extinguishers around your home or your garage or property, certainly that's not a bad thing to employ either.
Dan.
Well, I'll give you an example. Where I live is in an oak woodland type setting, blue oaks and grapevines, grass. And what I'm saying, and I think we're all saying, is you don't have to get rid of every tree around your house, but you need to create that space. So, for instance, we have a few trees right around the house for shade, but then I have about 150 feet from those trees out to the next trees, and that is cleared. Mow down all the grass every late spring when it dries out, so you don't have that high grass as a flash fuel. Also, in a place like California now, where we have, we are a Mediterranean climate with no rain for 4 or 5 months in the summer. We've removed the shrubs and bushes from right around the house that were up against the house, the hedge type things. Remove those and put down 5 feet or so of round river rock. Because what happens, those shrubs catch on fire, and then those sparks go up into the eaves through the screens that are under your eaves and also under the house. And if that happens, you're sunk. So the other thing you can do is buy those new screens that are double mesh screens, much finer, to keep embers and stuff out from getting up into your roof. And then be prompt in removing the leaves from your house from the roof in the fall. You don't wait for it to accumulate to 2 or 3 feet and then take it off. Try to do it regularly. So we're not saying you can't have trees and shade and the beauty that brings, but there are some things you can do to really make yourself smarter. You can also provide instructions to firefighters if you leave for an extended period. put an envelope up on the garage, tack it to it, and tell them, you know, you can get through this gate, you can go around this way. Just anything you can do to encourage them, because with CAL FIRE and the Forest Service, they always say this: if you as a homeowner don't make an effort, we're not going to make an effort. If you made an effort, we're going to try to save your house.
Well, I'll make my closing remark, and then I'll give each of you a chance to do so. The reason I asked the last question is that I'm not 100% sure that we weren't talking at a pretty high level in terms of some of the technicalities we did. So I decided we should end with something that every homeowner can relate to. That's why I gave you the last question. But you all answered all of the questions very well. So I'm happy you were able to join us, and happy to be the monitor of this discussion. And I'll leave it there. Dan, why don't you go next?
All right. Well, it was a pleasure to have this conversation. It's an important one to have. It's certainly fresh in our minds. There is a lot of work to be done. It has to be cooperative effort. It has to be funded. And we need to reduce the polarization or the temptation to politicize this whole issue. That's not productive. There are things we can do. It'll take a long time. It was stated earlier. It's not an overnight solution by any means, but that's no reason to give up. I mean, we as professional land managers, we need to point the way, lead the way, be objective in our opinions, and provide the expertise and the resources that we have at our disposal to help people get this done.
Chuck?
Yes, you know, I think we've covered a lot of territory, and I'm so glad we've had this discussion. I think awareness on behalf of people that live in these fire-prone communities is a very, very big deal. Be aware of what can happen. Be aware of what you can do to prevent it. For my part, I will point one more time to our television program, America's Forest. We're trying to bring these kinds of common sense things to the public through our program, so that they can be educated and do things that we all believe can help these wildfires and help prevent them. So I want to thank you, Mark, and thank my fellow panelists here. It's been a great discussion. Thank you.
Well, it's been fantastic. I think this is the beginning of many conversations in the coming months and years. Fire is not going to go away. I really believe the solution is education, making people aware, and of course, Chuck's show is leading that charge. We need more of that. Our people are not stupid. I deal with it all the time. Once they understand what we're talking about, they're on board with the things that we want to do with the forest and for the forest. So to me, education is everything, and certainly the younger generation needs to really carry the ball. We're all getting up there, you know, so I try to help kids and people understand what it is I do. And I'm really appreciative of being able to be a part of this presentation. I really am.
Well, thanks to all three of you. This is Mark Rey from Michigan State University signing off on behalf of Dan Tomaschesky from Sierra Pacific Industries, Bob Williams from Pine Creek Forestry, and Chuck Leavell, the keyboard player of the Rolling Stones, for the EarthX Conservation Network.
I should preface my remarks here by telling your viewers that everything I'll be talking about today can be found on our website, Evergreen Magazine, and that website is evergreenmagazine.com. A lot of information there, and I think you'll all find it very useful. One of the questions you asked me earlier was what I thought were the effects of local climate change on fuel loading levels in forests versus the improper management of those fuel loads. I think that climate change is probably best understood in its largest and longest term broadest context, if you will. About 20 years ago, I stumbled across the tree ring research program at the University of Arizona, and I found it to be really fascinating. The program draws its name from the fact that tree rings, which are proxies for the annual growth of trees, are also proxies for soil types and for swings in weather patterns. They account for not only periods of very wet weather, but also periods of very dry weather. Using this data, scientists from a variety of disciplines within the tree ring research program have actually mapped our climate some 2,000 years in reverse, which is interesting. And what we see when we look at this are sine waves up and down that reflect long-term warming and cooling trends that are anywhere from 175 to 350 years in duration. Embedded within these are many warming and cooling patterns. For example, here in the inland Northwest where I live, an area that begins in central Washington and runs into western Montana, we experienced a mini cooling period that ran from the early 1930s into the mid 1990s. The cooling period that we experienced coincided with the post-World War II ramp up of the federal timber sale program, as well as the Forest Service's well-intended effort to extinguish wildfires, to basically exclude wildfire from forests. In that era, fire was seen as the enemy. The a destroyer of forests, a utilitarian view that held by many people in that era and still held by some today, and also a destroyer of communities and lives. And this goes back to the 1870s, the Great Chicago Fire, for example, as well as some very, very large and deadly fires that burned in the Great Lakes states. In the post-war years, sun-loving ponderosa pine that grew prolifically here in our region was clear-cut without much consideration for the fact that in the absence of frequent fire, light burns, if you will, opportunistic white fir began to quickly colonize sites that have historically been dominated by ponderosa pine. Because of its very thick bark, ponderosa handled frequent and less intensive fires very well. On the other hand, white fir has much thinner bark and was generally killed at the seedling or sapling stage by even a light burn. In the absence of these light burns, white fir began to overtake sites that had been historically dominated by ponderosa pine. You can see evidence of this transition in photographs that were taken as early as 1874 in South Dakota and not very much later in central Washington. Forests were not very dense at that time, but over the years, as we have excluded fire, pine-dominated forests have been overtaken by white fir. And of course, as I said, white fir doesn't deal very well with fire, especially the kinds of fire we're experiencing today. In many places across the West, ponderosa pine forests that once held perhaps 10 to 15, maybe 20 large trees to the acre can now hold as many as 1,000 stems per acre. Very small trees no bigger around than your wrist. Far too many trees for the carrying capacity of the land, especially during periods of prolonged drought, which we're experiencing now. Stressed by a lack of moisture, soil nutrients, and sunlight, these forests have become easy prey for insects and diseases. And these trees are dying by the millions, if not billions. and they're fueling some of the largest forest fires for which we can find ecological evidence anywhere in history. Mortality now exceeds annual growth by a startling margin in almost every national forest in the West. I don't think this is very surprising given the forest conditions that we see all over the West today. We created this mess and we need to fix it before we can't. Fire ecologists that I know and trust tell me that we have probably no more than 40 years in which to rescue what we can rescue before wildfire takes the rest of it. I am frequently asked what we did in the past and what we need to do going into the future as it concerns the management of our forests in the Western United States, which are predominantly federally owned national forests. There are two courses of action that we can follow into the future, and I discuss both of them in my recently published book, First Put Out the Fire. The first is to simply let nature take its course, which means we should stand pat while nature, wildfire if you will, burns our Western federal estate to the ground, which is what's happening right now. I don't think this is even feasible given society's contemporary wants and needs: clean air, clean water, abundant fish and wildlife habitat, and a wealth of year-round outdoor recreation opportunity. The second course, and the one that I favor, is to develop and implement a large-scale program that combines mechanical thinning with prescribed fire, the goal being to reduce the risk that insects and diseases pose, which is always followed by inevitable wildfire. In doing so, we would slowly, and it is slow, slowly restore natural resiliency in our national forests. And by natural resiliency, I mean the ability of the forest itself to throw off modest levels of insect and diseases that attack before our forests become so dense that we're right back where we are today. Mechanical thinning and prescribed fire are time-tested, science-based tools that produce visually beautiful results. I have dozens of before and after pictures that prove this point, but not everyone agrees. Many Americans believe nature knows best. Others don't like logging on any scale. Others don't mind logging so long as the thinning work is done in a way that the trees can be disposed of without selling them to lumbermen who many people regard with suspicion or think they're greedy. They suggest that the trees be buried. I'm not sure how or where we would bury countless millions of trees, dead trees that now crowd our Western national forests. The Forest Service's fire ecologists estimate that we have between 90 and 100 million acres of forest land in the Western United States that are either in condition class 3, meaning it's ready to burn, or condition class 2, meaning it soon will be ready to burn. Let us remember that this is half our entire federal forest estate, and these are the forests that we're going to be passing along to the next generation. On a more positive and realistic note, I can tell you that when we show pictures, before and after pictures of the kind of thinning work I'm describing to the public, they're quite pleased by the visual results that they see. We first tested these ideas and these visuals in focus groups that were conducted by Frank Luntz during the run-up to the 2003 Healthy Forest and Restoration Act.
My name is Michael Rains. I am a retired Forest Service employee. I was born and raised in the barrios of East LA. I always call it the Compton-Linwood line. So that's East LA, for those of you that don't know. I grew up in California, went to school in California, and in 1965, I got a permanent full-time job with the United States Forest Service. Not a very luxurious job. I was a state carrier, GS2. And that summer, the Forest Service asked me, are you interested in going to college? Because I wasn't. I'm from very Depression era parents. We did not have money. And I said, I would love to go to college, but I don't have any money. So they said, if you can figure out a way to go to college, we will keep your permanent appointment and give you what's called educational leave without pay. Now for you, that doesn't mean much, but that was a sweet, sweet deal. So I went to community college, and I went to Humboldt State, which is a forestry school on the up by the Oregon border, Arcata, California. And I started my career. My education is forestry, watershed management, public administration, and secondary education. I have degrees in all of those. Since I retired in 2016, after almost 50 years with the Forest Service, I began to write extensively about wildland fire. I started my career permanent full-time as a firefighter, and eventually rose as the deputy chief of the Forest Service. That's #2 position. I was in charge of the fire and aviation management program. Since my retirement, I have seen catastrophic events, especially in the West, but not exclusive to the West, about the impacts of fire on people's lives, communities, our property, and I began to write. I began to write extensively to the President of the United States. Several letters have not been very successful, I might add. And then finally, I wrote this document called A Call to Action. And that's what I would like to just briefly talk about now, if you're willing to listen to me. Call to action is exactly what it says. When I actually didn't know that there was a standard term. When I was the director of the Northern Research Station with the Forest Service, I wrote a call to action on biomass uses, innovative uses of biomass that would help the fire problem. And I'm talking about wood-based nanotechnology, advanced composites. I'm talking about wood for energy, but different than what we typically use. And it actually is almost like coal-like products. And so I wrote this call to action for that, biomass uses. And because people are always saying that with the wood that is on the land, there's no effective, cost-effective use for that wood. And I said, well, not really. Let me give you a call to action. So then I use that term, a call to action, to address something much bigger. And that was a national crisis. The fires that we are experiencing, for frankly, the last 2 decades, are destroying our landscapes, our communities, our lives. In 2001, I was called upon by President Clinton to write a national fire plan. That was the small title. Department of Interior and Department of Agriculture banded together, and I was asked to author that report, and I did. And it was called the National Fire Plan, which exists today. The plan was designed to do 2 fundamental things: improve our fire capability, fire suppression capability, and improve our forest management. And since I've called that forest maintenance, 2 things. Unfortunately, what has happened is the fire suppression capacity has improved dramatically. Members of Congress, for example, have no compunction about spending $1 million an hour or appropriating $1 million an hour for fire suppression, yet our ability to be preventive with with forest management or forest maintenance, whatever you want to call it, has dwindled. So over the last 25 years or so, money has been shifted away from forest management to fire suppression. And so now the United States Forest Service, for all intents and purposes, has become the United States Fire Service. And it breaks my heart because we're so much better than that. So in 2018, after 2 years of writing and begging, I wrote what is called a call to action. And it basically consists of the following. first of all, a national commitment that fires are destroying a way of life in America. It calls for a statement of intent. And this is where the Secretary of Agriculture would stand up and say, I'm mad as hell. I'm not going to take this anymore. And here's what we're going to do. It would call for a vision. And the vision is pretty complete. It just basically says, forest maintenance is the elixir to reduce large-scale fires that are intense, that are killing people and destroying communities. And then it calls for a 10-year action plan with specifics. Not really different than anything we've ever said and talked. When I was deputy chief of the Forest Service, we had this discussion all the time. But unfortunately, nothing has changed. Our funding for this action is largely fighting fires. So we're reacting. We're not being proactive. Now, to not be too cruel, lately I've seen the California governor and the federal government looks like they have banded together. I say looks like because I'm not quite sure, but they have said that we want to devote some money together and go on a long-term effort to manage our forests. So catastrophic fires, we don't have to live with any longer. I don't know if this is going to be a call to action on their part, but it's intriguing. And I'm excited about that because it sounds to me like it's a wake-up call that other states across the country, especially the West, but not exclusive to the West, are going to embrace. You know, lately we've been talking about size of fires, and there's hundreds of thousands of acres that are burning in the West. But think about this. What if there was a 1,000-acre fire in the pinelands of New Jersey? In the West, we may not even begin to address the initial attack or start putting out the fire. In New Jersey, it would be catastrophic. And that's what's taking place. We have a national crisis on our hands. And my plea is to do something about it. The fundamental thing is a commitment. It's an intent statement. It is a vision. It is a strategy. And that strategy is backed up by resources, not just fire. Let me make something really clear. In 1996, the United States Forest Service, 16% of their budget was fire. If the 2021 budget prevails, the proposed budget prevails, 67% of the Forest Service budget will now be fire. What that fundamentally means is that everything else is secondary. Forest management or forest maintenance, whatever you'd like to say, science, state and private activities, they will be secondary. One of the greatest, let me say this, one of the proudest moments of my Forest Service career is I have worked in every mission area of the Forest Service: National Forest System, state and private forestry, administration, and research. So I know the complexities of that agency. And I am saying that it takes all those mission areas to make the Forest Service effective. It only takes one, fire, to make it become a national fire service. And the American people do not want that. Believe me, they do not want that. So I implore anybody who's listening, we need to embrace the call to action. So far, 4,000 people have signed on to the call to action. To be honest with you, it should be 4 million. And we should reach out to our leaders, president, members of Congress, governors, local leaders, and say enough is enough.